Okay, guys, today we are going to talk about the myth of the kind landlord. And we're going to look at Fife. And many Fife rental problems don't start with bad landlords, and they don't start with difficult tenants either. Here in Fife, as in many areas across the country, they usually start with a lot of good intentions and then silence. Now, silence around rental reviews, silence around maintenance, silence about what happens next when things change in life. For instance, now let me give you a scenario of something that I see more often than people probably realise. For instance, we had a tenant who moved into a two-bedroom terraced house in the Leven area around 2016. And at that time, the rent was very fair. I think it was around about £490 per calendar month. Now, it reflected the market, the condition of the property, the local demand at that time, and both the landlord and the tenant felt really comfortable at that time with that arrangement, and the relationship was positive from day one. Now, by the time we get to 2020, the monthly rent was still sitting at £490 per calendar month. Yet the market had risen to £533. Now, there's not much of a gap there, really. But then 2 years later, 2022, the landlord then increased the rent to £515. Yet the market rent at that point in 2022 was now £594. And then even further now to 2025, the rent was up to £564. Yet the market rent was £750. Do you see how the rent being set on the property is struggling to catch up with the actual market rent? Meaning the difference there at that point in 2025 was £185 per month from the actual rent being charged to the market rent at the time. So then it creates a big difference. To start with, when I said there, initially there wasn't a big difference, then quite quickly that gap starts to appear. And it does then create that situation where it's very hard to catch up with the market rent for the rent that you're actually charging your tenant. It can cause a lot of problems. I mean, from a landlord, and this landlord located in Leven's perspective, this really feels like a mistake at the time. The tenant pays reliably, they look after the home, there aren't any void periods, there's no advertising costs because you've got a tenant in situ, there's no awkward conversations. Increasing the rent feels really uncomfortable, especially when the tenant has been quite loyal, and that's something that the landlord thinks that they're doing the tenant a favour and themselves a favour and keeping the relationship quite seamless. But in actual fact, the need to keep the rent in line with market conditions is very important. Many landlords convince themselves they are doing the right thing by leaving things as they are, and that's not always the case. Now, just before we move on, I have got a chart that I've put together. Now, this is Leven rents. Hopefully you can see that clear enough. This is Leven rents for two-bed terrace properties, like I was just using as an example, from 2016 to 2025. And you see back in 2016, like this property that I was explaining, £490 was the actual rent being charged, which is the red line, and the market rent was £490. Now, as you see, it creeps up 2017, 2018, 2019, and then we get to that 2020 point. The blue rent is the market rent at £533. The rent still remained at £490, which is what I used in that example. And then from that point onwards, from 2020 over the last 5 years, it's crept up and crept up. And although the landlord then started to implement rent increases, it was never catching up with the actual market rent. In 2025, market rent £750, and we are got the landlord only charging £565, which leaves such a big gap, and it's quite hard to catch up with that. If they'd incrementally been increasing the rent consistently across all those years from 2016, just those small incremental increases, it would have been in line with the market rent, and there wouldn't be this big gap. So that's quite a good representation of the market in the Leven area. By all means, if anybody wants to have a copy of that and look at it, then just drop me a comment in the box, or you could reach out to me direct. My email and things is in the blog attached here. Any information I'm happy to share. Now, I spoke about it from the landlord's point of view, but you look at it from the tenant side, stability is everything. And they can build, their household budget around the rent that they are being charged. Children settle into local schools if they're located in that area for the school. The house becomes a home rather than just a rental. And they may notice that things like maybe the kitchen is starting to become dated if they're there for a long period of time. The bathroom might need some attention, but the rent feels fair for what they're getting, so they don't push. Seen this time and time again. Rents are low, there's maintenance required, but the tenant doesn't bring it to attention because they don't want to then bring to the attention to the fact that the rent is lower than what it should be. So then the property starts to suffer, but that's the tenant obviously trying to protect themselves. And this is where that slow drift begins. Rents in Leven from 2016, as I've just explained, have risen 53%. Yet landlords have only increased them by 15.3%. So you can see the differential there. And because the rents no longer reflect the market, the property often stops receiving the level of investment that it should in terms of upgrades and things. Small maintenance jobs, they get postponed. Bigger improvements are quietly shelved. Neither party feels quite justified in demanding more, whether that's the tenant demanding more in terms of maintenance and then the landlord demanding more in terms of rent, because the arrangement has become unspoken and informal, and low rents become part of the compromise. So you see where this all comes into play here. But then something that changes. The landlord's circumstances can change. It might be retirement. It might be a change in their job. It could be a separation in their own personal life, or simply they might need to release capital from this property. The decision is made then to sell. On paper, the property should be worth a certain figure. Though, with a sitting tenant paying £185 less per month than what the market rent is, the property will have a suppressed yield. And because the property needs some cosmetic work as well, it will not achieve the same price as one producing the full market rent. And then that leaves you as a landlord now facing options that you never really planned for. One option is to push the rent up really sharply to improve the figures and to improve the value of the buy-to-let home. Now, I know that kind of sounds like, and it might be a bit like forced appreciation. It is kind of like that. It's that kind of idea. I know forced appreciation isn't a thing that really actively is something in Scotland or indeed the UK, for want of a better word, but it is kind of like that. If you know what forced appreciation is, where the rent influences the property value. Another option is to remove the tenant and then sell with vacant possession. Yet most landlords hesitate, hoping that the problem will possibly resolve itself. And eventually pressure wins and the property goes on the market at a discounted price with a sitting tenant, and it sells for less than it should have done in the first instance in the right circumstances. And then at that point, the tenant believes they are out of the woods, yet nothing can be further from the truth. The new landlord or the new landlord owner doesn't have the emotional connection with that tenant or the obligation to see that tenant right as the previous landlord did. So it brings the rent, so they bring the rents up themselves to that market level. When the rental increase lands, this jump can be, sometimes many hundreds of pounds. And for a tenant who has shaped their life around the previous rent, this can be really unmanageable and quite shocking and as well. And that then creates a situation where the tenant is in a position where they've got this additional extra over and above what they've budgeted for. And what follows is rarely smooth. Negotiations fail, notices have to be served, stress levels will of course be risen, In worst case scenarios, it ends up in legal action and forced moves, which is obviously, establishing a point where we need to obviously regain possession of the property through legal channels. And nobody feels good about any of that. Yet everyone feels trapped by the decision made years earlier by the original landlord. So you can see how these decisions, or this lack of making decisions so early on in a tenancy and an investment, can have quite detrimental effects later on, whether it passes on to the new owner or the tenant that's in situ. And the uncomfortable truth about both Fife landlords and tenants is that regular, modest rent increases and reviews are usually the kindest option over time for everyone, and that includes the tenant. Gradual increases allow tenants to adapt. Fair market rents allow landlords to maintain properties properly to a good standard. And most importantly, they reduce the likelihood of sudden sales that can trigger a lot of upheaval for everyone involved. Now, this is not about squeezing a tenant for everything that they have or defending bad practice either. It's about recognising that pretending the market does not exist and does not protect people, it just delays the consequences. So slow, predictable change is far easier to live with than sudden, drastic shock. And I think sometimes when you look at this like the fairest option in the moment, it quietly plants the seed for crisis years down the line. Do you know that? And just as I say, if you had made these small incremental changes periodically throughout the initial stages and throughout the tenancy, it just totally avoids this crisis at the end and further down the line for everybody involved. Now, this might be a familiar scenario to you, it might not. I've seen it happen quite a lot, especially now with the changes in the market, and landlords need to have their property valued in line with market conditions and market values. And it's not just about squeezing the tenant and the landlord benefiting, it's all for the tenant's benefit as well and everybody involved. If you fall into this category of, the kind landlord is what I've titled it, but it's this whole killing with kindness type thing. But if you do fall into that category of the kind landlord and you manage your own property, then you might find what I've said ringing quite true, or maybe ringing alarm bells with you. And if you would like to have a chat and get some advice about that or my opinion, then by all means feel free to reach out to me, jump in the comments box. You could reach out to me direct. My details are attached to this. My email address is richard.cook@fifeproperties.co.uk, and I would be happy to have that informal chat and give you some advice. And for everyone else watching, possibly let me know what you think. These are my thoughts, and these are my experiences with real life things that have happened, and I see it happening time and time again, and more commonly nowadays. So what are your thoughts? Again, if you wanted to just pick my brain and reach out, you are welcome to do so. And yes, so that is the myth of the kind landlord and how it can have a knock-on effect on all involved if you are not carrying out best practice and keeping in line with market conditions. Thanks for tuning in today, guys. As I say, I'm always happy to help, and I'll catch you on the next one. I'm Richard Cook, and I'll leave it there for today. Okay, thanks, guys.